Wow, that's great.
Yeah, that was.
It was a good thing that that
Yeah. She was really good. But she was she had a regular teacher. I think she's still teaching. But she's, I'm not, you know, that's the. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Detroit Public Library.
Hello.
Today, I am Christine Peel, co-chair of the Detroit Public Library's Author Series. For a moment, I will take off my mask to speak to you. Today, we are here to present Dr. Maryemma Graham and Dr. Melba Boyd. We'll start with Dr. Boyd. Dr. Boyd is a distinguished professor in African American Studies at Wayne State and an award-winning author of 13 books, 9 of which are poetry. Boyd's poetry, essays, and creative nonfiction have appeared in anthologies, academic journals, cultural periodicals, newspapers in the United States and Europe. She has a Doctor of Arts in English from the University of Michigan. She is a Detroit poet, essayist, biographer, editor, filmmaker, and distinguished professor. And earlier this year, she was honored with a Kresge Eminent Artist Award. Maryemma Graham is our author today with her book, The House Where My Soul Lives. And she is a professor of English at the University of Kansas. In 1983, she founded the History of Black Writing at the University of Mississippi. She and the history of Black Writing have been at the University of Kansas since 1988 with 12 published books, including the Cambridge History of African American Literature with Jerry W. Ward Jr., the most comprehensive literary history to date. Her most recent book, The House Where My Soul Lives, The Life of Margaret Walker, was published in 2022. She is widely recognized for her public humanities programming within the US and beyond. So I'd like to welcome both ladies to the Detroit Public Library. So let's get started, ladies. Should.
There you go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can't tell, it's weird. It's my pleasure to be here today with Maryemma. We go way back. Not way back, but way back. It's really important to be here to talk also about Margaret Walker, who was and is a critical part of the development of African American poetry. Specifically, she also has a major Detroit connection. Dudley Randall published her poetry, and this was a big part of the mission when he founded Broadside Press, and that was to bring back into print important and prominent, certainly prominent in our community, poets who had been neglected by mainstream publishers. And she was on the top of the list with poets like Sterling Brown. And so it was our pleasure to be a part of Margaret's legacy and bring her poetry forward at a time when people were actually very, very interested and motivated by Black literature, Black poetry in particular. And it was the beginning of the Black Arts movement. And her presence was critical on so many levels. And so today we're gonna be able to listen to Maryemma talk about the book, but also what I found very fascinating was the process, accessing papers, being able to sift through all of that and to complete the project. So could you start by talking about why and how and all of that?
Okay, but can I add to your Detroit Margaret Walker story too? Because you're absolutely right. Her relationship to Dr. Mandel was really important. And what I like to think is that this redirected her career, allowed her to reclaim her career, because she had not published since a volume of poetry. The same poem appeared in a lot of places. She had not published since 1942. And so in 1970, and they pursued her aggressively, like, I need some poetry from you and I need it now. And she came to Detroit, and American Library Association met in June, and it came maybe July, and she came up with that, and there was a book, Prophets for a New Day. It was the first book she published since 1942. So this gave her back her career. And I think that's really, really important. It gave her career. And then she developed friendships from that time. One of her benefactors is Dr. Walter Evans, a Detroit surgeon. Walter Evans, who had some rare images that I used in the book, which was my goal, in addition to all that overwhelming material that Walker herself lived. Walker had a relationship to many different photographers, Black photographers, and I wanted to showcase their work, particularly Roy Lewis, Robert Townsend Jones, a couple of people who are no longer living, but the legacy of their work through images remains. So to go back to answer your question, I like to think that Walker was telling people, I have a story that somebody got to tell. I can't tell it. I want to. She started 2 autobiographies, her own books. They didn't get finished. They were very little more than an outline, which was good for me. But she left everything. She was an inveterate writer. When I was on my way here, I had to do a talk at the Hall Center, and I was in front of a lot of Americanists, American literature people, and so I called her a damn scribbling woman, because it's a phrase that Mark Twain used in the 19th century. He said that all those damn scribbling women are keeping people from reading my books. And so Walker was one of those damn scribbling women who wrote everything down. She kept a journal. She recorded her doings, her seeings, her being, her thoughts. She narrated stories, unfinished books, everything is in the journals. But we don't have as much, the products, of course, are more limited. So she left all of the writing and literally every scrap of paper. If she took a trip on the train ticket is in the archive. Train stuff. And of course, if you think about it, and I've been learning this recently, the train is the perfect place to write. So she lived through one time, and it was terrible. She never did it. So she was on the train all the time. And then in regular life, she drove everywhere. And so the train was where she kept up. You could see, she was going from Maryland to DC or to Jackson, New Orleans. And she would record all her notes and thoughts. So in addition to every scrap of paper regarding anything she was doing, she kept these journals. And so it was an overwhelming amount of material. I've talked to other photographers, and they're saying usually the problem is they don't have enough, or what they have is too fabricated. I'm sure that Walker was conscious of coming behind her and reading what she said. So I think she was also fabricating at times, telling people what she wanted them to know, not necessarily what they needed all about her life. So my my journey was to match everything I found with 3 other sources of information. So in part, that's one reason why the book took 20 years. The other reason was me and life, everything going on and having to stop and start and stop and start. But the journals themselves were just a treasure trove because she wrote she was writing to someone. One long, eternal letter. 138 notebooks, spiral bound, the big kind, composition books, front and back pages, 138. And that's just the journals that she kept from the time she was 12 years old until about 1997, because by that point the cancer had slowed her down so that she could not write as well. And so there really are pages of the journals where you see her handwriting trailing on in those last pages where she just couldn't write anymore. So that was the stuff that got me started. And they were in the process of being digitized, but I couldn't wait for that to happen. So, because I'm starting reading in the early 20th century, 21st century. So I'm going to Jackson, Mississippi every summer. The person in my family who remembers this most is my son, because it was hot as hell. And he's like, who goes to Mississippi in the middle of the summer, Mom? Putting him in summer camp, so he's outside all day. So I'm in the cool library all day reading. I did that multiple summers to read and kept my own notebook and extracted from that. So I ended up with my own notebook of notes that were on her, based on her journal notes. But since I had to verify everything 3 times, I had to go to Chicago Library, the Vivian Harsh collection, where she spent time because her life did go from Birmingham birth to New Orleans childhood and through high school and 2 years of college, to Chicago for the rest of her college years, to Iowa, and just began a teaching career in the South, and ultimately settling at Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi, where she spent the remainder of her life. And she never took another position other than visiting. So I had to go to all the places that constituted archives, because as you all advertised, Walker comes at the tail end of this Harlem Renaissance. And in fact, if you think about the Harlem Renaissance as the new Negro Renaissance and other cities are involved, she is squarely in the middle of the Chicago version of that. When we think about Harlem, we think about New York, but that Renaissance had other cities pretty much back to back. And the 30s were primarily Chicago. And so she is in that mix. And so one of the things I like about the book is that we did a collage of the Southside Writers Group in Chicago, because there was never a picture of the group together, but I had pictures of them individually in clusters. And so I put this collage so people could see who were the friends. That's why I call them friends and members of the Southside Writers, which was a writers' club. It was where they did politics, they debated, they read, versions of their work to get feedback. It was the, the writers' club that we now know are so famous. John O'Killen's Writers' Club. We have these clubs everywhere now. They've been really important in the development of writers, but she was central to that Chicago group. Having to verify so much, the other task, a challenging one, was the voice in the book. So if Walker could, she would have written her own story. If she had lived long enough and was strong enough, she would have written her own story. I know that. She knew that I was going to write. We talked about that. So But her story, her voice is preserved because I quote heavily from the journals. So we've got three voices in the book. She's telling the story. I have a timeline, and the table of contents is your cheat sheet. I always tell people that's what I do. I looked at the biography as I was reading. It was like, this book is going to be long. Maybe people don't want to go from page 1 to page 700 or whatever. Well, I didn't tell you in the table of contents, this is the Alabama period. This is the New Orleans period. This is the New York period. This is the Chicago. So you can skip around and follow the geography of her life if you want to do that. So the timeline takes you through her life. And the table of contents is pretty specific with regard to that. And by the way, the chapter titles are all hers. Those are words from her journals, except for the one that says every book is a child, every book is a child, or every child is a book I didn't write. And that was from Arnold Thomas, who was criticizing her for having so many children. Like, God, every child is a book you can't write. And I thought, what a perfect quote. And so I used that. But every other quote in there is hers. Something from her journals, something from what she said that I thought stood out to me. Yeah. So her voice is there in the journal quotes throughout the scan, some longer than others. The timeline is there. Then my voice. I am sort of a talking back person. When I present what happened with events, then I discuss them, I comment on their significance, I critique them. Because if we were just giving her story and accolades and what she accomplished, this would be what they call hagiography. That is not what biography is supposed to be. So I really wanted to try to find that third voice. That's what took a lot. So that third voice, that's the one I would like a lot of feedback on. That voice that I tried to create to explain why I thought this was happening. That was happening. For instance, in her suit against Alex Haley.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
That had to have a lot of explanation.
Yeah, I was at a writers' conference in Atlanta that Hoyt Fuller had organized at Emory University, and Dudley and I went to that conference, and she sat with us for dinner at one of the events, and she actually talked to us about the whole crisis, basically, and she was really actually very calm, but also obviously upset. And she said it was difficult for her to decide to do the lawsuit that she said her son talked her into.
I think it's the other way around.
Other way around. She said, well, let me tell you what she said. I'm going to tell you what she said in Atlanta. Okay, well, anyway, she said that
Hold a second. Does everybody know what we're talking about?
No.
She sued Alex Haley. She sued Alex Haley for plagiarizing in his book Roots. That's what we're discussing.
Yeah, it was, and it was a big deal because Roots was a big deal. And so she said that her son said, "Look, you send me to law school, so like I have these skills, and so you need to do something. We need to do something about that." And so it's so it was really good. So go ahead. I want to hear the other part.
It was 10 years after Roots came 10 years after Jubilee was published, 76, and her book was published, Jubilee, the novel, 1966. So Walker was given Roots, and she had brought Alex Haley to Jackson State. They were good friends. They had all kinds of encounters with each other. But when she read Roots, and her children did have a place, or at least play a role in this because they brought her the book. They brought her the book. She had this habit of going to the hospital after every major event that she would have. And so it was sort of like that was her vacation away from home, is to go to the hospital and rest and recuperate. I mean, yes, her diabetes was out of control because her diet was poor, but she was often in the hospital, after the big things in her life. So they brought her Roots to read. She read it. According to her notes, she found 150 instances of plagiarized work from Roots. In Roots from Jubilee. And she was outraged. You're right. And you were one of many people that she told her story to. She was constantly talking about it. Many of her friends stop talking about it. That's making it worse. It troubled her deeply. Many people perceived it as she's just jealous because his book is getting more attention than hers. Walker never bought into that, but because she talked about it so much, it made it look like jealousy, other things. And because, as you know, Roots had an incredible launching. The film came shortly. It was well orchestrated. The book was there, and then the film was in production. Some people didn't know that at the same time, and then it made its appearance shortly after. So they capitalized majorly on Roots as a film and Roots as the book. And so Walker sued. She lost. Here's the killer. 3 other people sued. And they all won, or she settled by the court. And I always ask this question to people who don't know. What do you imagine, or who do you imagine those other 3 people were? That is also suing for plagiarism. Were they all men? All men and
All white.
All white.
Yeah. In fact, I talked to a friend of mine, an attorney, last night, and we had this conversation.
Yes.
And he was saying, yeah, I found it suspicious that everyone who's suing and won were all.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm like,
So I'm just going to read that little section because I think it does, one, I consolidated it more, and so I want to make sure I get it in here. So it was a 2-year battle, first of all. Sued, the case, the hearing, blah, 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 and where she lost. But here's the end of the story. In 1993, Haley's cultural halo was removed with the revelations from the painstaking research conducted after his death by Philip Noble. 15 years after Walker's suit, her allegations were proven correct. Roots was a carefully recreated narrative from multiple published sources, including Jubilee. Noble could verify none of Haley's work in the Gambia. Dates, location, events, and interviews did not match, nor could any sources be identified. Haley had not only plagiarized, but he had also fabricated his research process. No vindication was necessary for Walker. She knew from the beginning and did not require any new supporting information. Haley was dead, and her strong beliefs would not allow her to speak ill of him. Noble's concluding observation is telling. White guilt and the sense of Black solidarity had conspired to protect Haley, making victims of us all. My comment here is racism is never a one-way street. In 1996, Dr. Walter Evans, one of Walker's sponsors, as I said, who brought her to Detroit on the tour for the Divine Genus, the book on the biography to write. privately published a broadside. Except for her copious journal entries, that broadside, Setting the Record Straight, remains the only published record. The publication was also a triumph for her in another way. On the inside cover, the image of Elizabeth Catlett's sculpture, Homage to Black Women Poets, faces Walker's dedication line, and I quote, "To young Black women poets," end quote. Walker held no grudges against those who stood silent during the entire Roots controversy. Roots had taught Walker the awful pain a Black woman feels when she tries to penetrate the shield that carefully protects Black men from their bullets. She needed only satisfaction that she'd done the right thing and watched it run its full course. So here she is living, he's dead. Plagiarism was true. She lost, they won, but her reputation was in ruins. That was a shadow over the longer part of her career, the latter part of her career. But also it affected the book that would come another 10 years later, that is Richard Wright, The Modern Genius. So the receipt of that book, the critical reception of that book was, in a sense, impacted negatively by this previous reputation of jealousy or angry Black woman, all of those kinds of phrases. And that led us to this quote that Nikki Giovanni often uses, that Margaret Walker was the most famous person that nobody knows because she was famous for these things and not what she should have been famous for, or what I say in the chapter, she went from fame to empathy. She was well known, famous. The book was the poem, the book For My People was most widely read. Everybody knows it, everybody recites it. But we go from that to something much worse, and she never recovered. So that was the root story, and that's where you were one of those who listened. She told everybody, she complained to everybody, and people couldn't get her to shut up. Well, that was the one thing.
Yeah,
that
well,
she
I
could-
mean, my response, Phyllis' response was, I mean, we had read Jubilee before Roots.
Right, 10 years before, yeah.
We're like, duh. It was so obvious. I mean, it was like, you understand what I'm saying? So, you know, as an editor, it's one of the things that you're always having to concern yourself with, that make sure that people are not ripping off somebody else, right? And people do, right? And the whole sort of, we were just sort of, I mean, we felt that she was justified. We thought it was blatantly obvious. And then I think the other part of that, which was very interesting, was when we also got busted, that so-called, I went and actually found Utopia, I found the oral, blah, 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 that was all made up, super dramatic, good TV, but it was bullshit. And as you know, and all of that was just layers on top of layers. And I also thought about the fact that it was part of the problem with, you know, living in the United States, dealing with capitalism, what you can sell and how well you can sell it. And they sold it. They sold it.
Yeah, and that was why it was absolutely important that Haley could not win. He could not, I'm sorry, that he had to win, of course, and she had to lose. She could not win, he had to lose. Even though, as I said, other people did settle out of court or won, but they had fewer instances, number one, of the plagiarism. She had 150, maybe somebody else had 35. And so it didn't look like it was as serious. Hers was a larger mammoth case that would have unsettled too much. But it was, the thing we remember about Roots, and this is not something I guess we think about today, is that the way in which the book industry and the film industry are now wedded, that was the beginning of that phase. Miniseries, television, I mean, they were doing the film routes at the same time the book was about to appear. So it was not accidental that the film came shortly thereafter. So the combination of wealth and, as you say, capitalism and the gains to be received from this marriage of these two things was just, it was too hard. You couldn't afford to lose. It would have been an expose of incredible significance. But years later, he's dead. The truth comes out, but it doesn't do her any good. She's still living, he's dead, but do her any good. But that was a pretty rough period. And as I said, she lost many friends. The one friend that I was able to interview extensively was Mari Evans. And Mari Evans was the one who said to her, a poet, Mari Evans, just stop talking about it. You need to let it go. People were trying to advise her, this could mean no good for you. It could do nothing good for you. But she didn't listen. And so, but it was that person, in my mind, that demonstrates most the kind of integrity that Margaret Walker had, the kind of will, determination. If I'm going to do something, I am going to do it all the way. If right is right.
This is a little sort of off the Margaret. As you're talking, it makes me think about it's sort of not out of the ordinary for Black artists to get ripped off in this country. I mean, music, design,
Big music, yes.
So it became popular at that moment that okay, we can market this whole slavery thing, right? Now they want us to shut up, but anyway, at that time it was hot, and I just also though remember, and I know for her it was quite devastating, but I also remember everyone sort of saying, "I'm not surprised," or "That's what they do," and we didn't believe it. We didn't. I know because it was her work. She got ripped off, but we kept reading and teaching Julie, and we understood what had occurred. And I do want to mention that there at the African Women Writers Conference that Jane Cortez, she put two together, and one of them, she honored Black women, and Ruby Dee was honored, and since Margaret Walker could not be there, Jane asked me to accept the award on her behalf, as Black woman poet. And so I would like to think that she realized that, she was still highly appreciated and respected, and certainly within the community of writers,
And I think that it is true, but there is still the question of why she was so determined to file that suit. She did not have the best representation, let me just say that. Son or not, being a lawyer. He was not, an experienced New York lawyer. Other people had those kind of lawyers, and so he had not been in practice that long. So yes, you can believe that right, went out in the wind, but no, it's about the best representation. She did not have that. But you have to understand also where Jubilee falls in the history of her work. This was based on a family story. So it's near and dear to her heart. Exactly. This was the story her grandmother had been telling her that formed the nucleus of the novel. It's a novel, historical novel, the predecessor to the neo-slave narrative as we call it today. But it was a story, the roots of the story were told to her from her grandmother who raised her. So she was the guardian of this story that she started when she was in undergrad school and finished 20, 30 years later into a novel. So for somebody to take her truth and make it their truth, and she knew it could not have been, was extremely, upsetting. I mean, she was irrational, I would have to say, as people described it to me. In the early days, and of course, when she lost this, she would begin the discussion about it and she would become irrational. But it had to do with that particular story and the importance that it had in her life.
That's right.
And so she was pushed to do it. There was no way she could not protect her family history. And it is a family narrative. I mean, she transposes her great-grandmother or her grandmother, Elvira, was her great-grandmother, but she uses that story. And the name, of course, Irie, comes from the actual name of her grandmother, great-grandmother. But it was just that important to her. And it was, what she had promised her grandmother she would do. And she would tell that story. She would use that family history to become sort of a public narrative about slavery. And the placement of the book, 1966, makes it the first modern narrative of its type since the books were written in the 1920s and 30s, and they were not written from the modern perspective. So she really is trend-setting in terms of what Jubilee means and what it helps to launch. Because by the 70s and certainly 86 with Morrison, you get this whole genre of the neo-slave narrative. But Walker's story is the beginning. Jubilee is the beginning of that. And it does go through the period of the Civil War, post-slavery, as well as events leading up to the Civil War. But again, it's fictionalized. But the truth, and you see the picture, in the book, there's a picture of Elvira. Elvira is a character. It is a real picture. It is her great-grandmother. So there's a true element, but again, it's based on the truth. So that was what faction now. But that was why it was so important to her to preserve that truth. Because it was hers, it was not going to be violated. He violated that. And that's where you have to kind of see where she was so intense and could not be moved, could not be convinced to do otherwise. When people said, you can't do that, you'll never win. Other people did, but of course she was the first. That was also probably the factor in the other people winning, is because, okay, this is 3 times. Clearly there's something going on here. The courts are going to be, people are going to distrust the courts too, if nobody is going to say that this is in fact plagiarism. So,
Can I get you to talk a little bit about her experience at University of Iowa? That was another place that I taught at University of Iowa, famous University of Iowa's Writers Workshop, right? And she was one of very few Black writers to go to Iowa when she did after Northwestern. And from what I understand, it was not a happy experience for her.
so what I like about that part of her life is that it really gives us, and I say this to my students who are coming to PWIs now, like, you all need to read that story, and they all talk about it. I'm so glad you wrote that book because you told us that story so many times about what it was like to go to a PWI in the 1930s and 40s. What was it like to go to grad school at that time? Now, there were a number of people in school at Iowa, Black people going to Iowa in school. And Walker had lost her job for the WPA. It ended. And so she had to find something to do. And so she applied late to Iowa, got in, and ended up going there for her master's. Otherwise, she would have gone home. She was fighting like hell not to go home. That's a constant theme throughout the book, is the parents are saying, come home, come home. No. I want to be a success. I can't come home. That tug of war. And so she goes there. Elizabeth Catlett becomes a roommate. Elizabeth Catlett, the sculptor, becomes a roommate. They were best friends. I had a 3-hour conversation with Elizabeth Catlett. She talks about how Walker cried all the time. She was miserable. She was miserable because of the breakup, so-called breakup with Richard Wright. but she was also miserable because she was emotionally uneven. There is some mental health issue there that early in her life had been identified, wasn't given constant attention. She managed it more or less in her own way. But I did make the point in the book that this is an early indication of parents seeking help for a child who needs some kind of diagnosis. And so she's at 17 and 19, she's actually going to a psychiatrist, so to speak. It's not the best treatment at the time, but it was she was emotionally fragile during that Iowa period. But it was a really difficult period. She is in literature. She chose not to do the writer's workshop, although the people she studied under were the same people who were doing the writer's workshop. Now, why? She felt that a traditional master's, a traditional PhD would get her a better job, because at this time, she recognized that she was not going to earn a living as a writer. That was clear. She needed a job. Her parents had been educated. They had wanted their children to be educated. They were all educated. And so she goes to Iowa to school. But friendships were hard. Finances were really rough. She was emotionally fragile, as I said. And she fought with her teachers all the time. That's the part I love. She was outspoken. She did not hold back. Even in the writing of the poems, her professors were trying to direct her to write in a certain traditional way. And she said, no, I'm not going to do that. And so she insisted, for instance, For My People was the book that was her master's thesis. She insisted on a blended volume. There are folk songs, i.e. poems, in the volume, along with more modernist style poetry. This is the era of modernism. This is when you're writing in a very different vein. So she's gonna use that method for some of her poetry, but she's not gonna give up resistance in poetry, and she's not gonna give up the folk form that she knew well. So the book is a combination of all of that. And so she fought with her teacher, who had said, that's not what we're writing today. You need to be writing. She said, no. And in all of her work, you see that mixture, that blend. Prophets for a New Day, October Journey, This Is My Century, her collected works. You see Walker blending or working across these different genres of poetry so that she represents the folk culture and the formal, literate, high-brow, if you want to use that term, poetry of the era. She refused to let one go for the expense of the other.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, she's so much what you see in that generation. Dudley Randall does the same thing. They can write across cultures. Sterling Brown, I mean, and they are adamant about championing and keeping the African American literary tradition, which is grounded in folk songs, in the spirituals, and you can see it in different poems where they use that as their structural models to writing the poem. But they can do the other thing too. They can write the sonnets, they can write, modern styles. But when I hear about Margaret, and I don't know if she knew this, but they were still talking about her when I got to Iowa in 1982. And the thing is, she was absolutely right to do what she did and take the degree that she took, because when I was there, I was not in the workshop. I was not a professor in the workshop. I was in the African American Studies program and in the English department, and I was always having to sit on committees with students of color in the workshop, because the workshop kept beating them, trying to change their voice, and to take their identity out of their writing. And they would come, Melba, I need your help. So I was the backup person who could go in there. And the other irony, of course, is that I was possibly, unfortunately, possibly the first Black woman teaching the English department at the University of Iowa. And it was a fight, a fight. I mean, they were like, some of those old heads they were still there and pushed, even though to a large extent it had changed and there were people who were fighting for me to be there. But it was still a fight. And I thought to myself, well, I can just got to be Margaret Walker went through some of this, so it's cool, I can deal with it. But you had to, that kind of repression. And I wish one of my grad students was here today, but she's writing an article, she did her dissertation on these workshops and how they attempt to undermine the condition, the sort of perspective of African American writers. And but definitely I'm gonna, we've talked about this, historically and certainly like talk about Margaret Walker.
So what happened when she went back the second time is kind of interesting. That is, this is the first, this question that you're talking about was the master's. She went back in the 60s for her PhD. So this is an older woman returning to school. This is what that story is. One of the women, and I think it might have been the only woman in the department at Iowa, was a white woman. She never got promoted. She taught in the English department. She remembered Walker, and she offered her housing so that she could get through it. So this is an older white woman who was retired by this time, had taught in Iowa, and said, yes, you can stay with me, and I will help you with this process. So these two women, interestingly enough, are working together to make sure that Walker does not have the same experience that she had before. And she went 2 summers, took her kids during that time, went back for another full year, did all the coursework for the PhD, and then Jubilee became the dissertation. Right. And it was probably one of the largest dissertations they had ever had, 2 or 3 volumes. It was not just one book. It was, if you look, I have a shelf picture of it in the book so people can see that she trimmed it down to a readable book. But it was a huge historical volume that she produced as part of her dissertation. But that second experience was notably different because this woman had sort of served as had intervened on what would have been a difficult situation. Now, she still fought with her professors.
Right, now listen, what you said, the only woman, check that out.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a big department. I mean,
University of Iowa.
It's 60 faculty. When I was there, there were like 60 some faculty, and at that point, there were only 2 women.
Yes.
And that's 82.
So, and she had retired, so that meant she would have been there in the 30s and the 40s. So she came in, she had finished Iowa, but she just worked as an instructor. She taught as an instructor for a long time. I had hoped to be able to get to her. She left everything to Iowa. That is the one collection I did not get to see. It was during COVID and I just couldn't get to it. I know I have 2 former students teaching at Iowa, but they said the collection was shut down, we couldn't get to it. But it was an interesting experience, those 2 different times that she was there. She was there with younger people when she was in her 30s, in her 30s, but, or 39, 38, 39. But when she went back in the 60s, 62, 63, she was a mature woman, children about to finish high school. They were ages, 9 or 12 to 18. And she was, again, clear about what she wanted to do, but she was determined to do that. And one of the reasons had to do with really sustainability. She didn't know if she could stay at Jackson State without that PhD. She felt that she needed to prove that she complete the process so that she could stay at Jackson State. She was not ready. She wasn't going to move. She knew that by then. Many of her friends had moved and gone out elsewhere. She was not going to do that. She was committed to the HBCU system. And her life was in Jackson, without a doubt. In the center, of course, that she had.
Question.
Got some questions? Yeah. So
If things were so bad in Iowa the first time, why did she go back?
Because she wanted to get a PhD and she wanted to finish where she started.
But she couldn't. Well, she could have gone anywhere else, right?
it would have, she was, the same people who taught her before were still there. So she was continuing a process.
Oh,
And so to try to start all over again at someplace else
Yeah, but I
would
think,
have been much more difficult.
I think what Jane, the thing about going to the institution when you start, she would have gotten credit
Right.
for her master's hours and that time toward her PhD.
Right.
And that makes a big difference because that's another whole another year of coursework that she might have had to do at another institution.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking practically,
Yes.
it made sense.
But also, there were several things in her favor. She had a strong teaching record, and so she could get financial support in the second return that she did not get in the first return. She was in touch with those professors throughout. She was always in touch with those same people. And in fact, they visited Jackson State over the course of the Writers Workshop. She became very good friends with her professors. So she was not, this was not a separation at the master's time. It was, I want to finish, but I don't know when. And she had always wanted to go back, but it just kept getting longer and longer until she could find a moment where she could separate from the family, where her parents could help raise the younger children, and then one could go off to college and the other soon after. So she was, and also both her children went to school in Iowa. So it was a networking, if I can put it that way. It was getting the kids to college in Iowa while I'm finishing my PhD at Iowa. Now, they didn't go to Iowa, but went to other schools. So she made a whole family arrangement around going back to school, and two younger children who had not finished high school yet. So that was why it was the most logical thing to do.
I get it. Any other questions or comments?
So where are her papers? Okay, so that part, so as I said, I actually brought flyers from the Margaret Walker Center, but they got taken by all the other places I've been. So she left all of her papers. You heard me talk about the journals. The Margaret Walker Center was founded in, it had a different name, the Institute it was called at that time. In 1969, she founded this Institute for the Life, History, and Study of Black Culture of Black People. Funky name. It is now the Margaret Walker Center. It has all of her papers. She left everything there. But her intent was to have an archive in the South at an HBCU that would record the 20th century. A lot of things from the 19th century were in different places and collections, but she was focusing primarily on the 20th century. And when you think about her life cycle, 1915 to 1998, she is clearly a 20th century person. So all of the papers that she left, her entire collection, is at Jackson State in the Margaret Walker Center. It is its own center. It's well preserved. It is one of the historic buildings at Jackson State. They've had multiple rounds of funding, and they were, as far as I know, one of the first collections that began to digitize. They had some digital files when I started reading in the turn of the 21st century. They are only digitizing certain materials. They might now be able to do more because the members of the family, 3 of her children have passed, only 1 living child. And the grandchildren are much more supportive of that. But this is obviously a problematic area in terms of collections with living family members. But it is there at Jackson State. Now, work on Margaret Walker, writings about Margaret Walker, and encounters with Margaret Walker exist other places because she was part of so many movements. You know, our community correspondence with Richard Wright is at Yale. And I used heavily, again, I used those documents. So that's what I was saying. I had to verify everything I found because if she wrote a letter to Richard Wright, that letter was not at Jackson State. It's at Yale.
Sure, that's where she sent it to.
That's right.
The recipient.
And so they have it bound, and I could follow the thread of what was going on. And she's recording all those happenings at the Southside Writers Group. She was the recorder. She was reporting on the meetings. She took over after he left to go to New York. She took over the leadership of that group. And so, but all the letters are at Yale. So I could track, again, do the timeline based on all of that material.
Janet, you had a question?
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for being here. I'm the bookseller and we have your book in the store. And I have to admit that I had the privilege of reading a manuscript because I was serving on the National Book Award Foundation nonfiction panel. So I am super excited to even see your face and to be in such admiration of your work. Along with the many other books that we've asked you to do that, was the new book on Paul Laurence Dunbar. And I just wonder, is there a connectivity that you can draw between the two of them? He was a little earlier, died earlier, but he was also he hopped around to different genres too.
So the Paul Laurence Dunbar story is an interesting one because, you know, Dunbar left more standard English poetry than he did dialect poetry. He became known for dialect poetry. And I actually grew up in a town, I was talking earlier about my family was a member of those who stayed, didn't migrate. And so I grew up where people were reading Dunbar too in my hometown. These were not academics. They were just reading it in church events and social events. People would be reading Dunbar. So I would know about Dunbar. Walker grew up in that tradition as well. She grew up reading Black poets, and Dunbar was one of the ones she would read. And that is how that tradition gets preserved. But Dunbar left a huge amount of work that has been compiled and published, but it was, the market was for dialect poetry at the time, and his sponsor encouraged that poetry to be published. And that is what he was known for. And of course, he did it well. And he was very popular as a result of that. And it's a very sad story. Walker didn't have the same difficulty because she included everything in the same volumes. She didn't have just a volume of dialect poetry or a volume of it. She put it all in one volume. It'd be a different section of the book. And she, as Melba was saying, she did fight constantly to maintain the right to do it the way she chose to do it. Throughout her journals, she is, I would say, yelling, at least in the journal, she's yelling, but you know she's had a fight with her professor about what, and when she got older, she just got more, intense. If she was intense in her 20s, by the time she goes back to school in her 50s, it's pretty hard to resist what she's saying because she's definitely, saying, I'm going to do it this way. I'm not going to do it that way. She had trouble writing the language in Jubilee because the professors were trying to get her to standardize her English. And ultimately, she had to do that. She had to write in what we call high dialect because people couldn't have read the book. I mean, we have trouble reading Zora Neale Hurston now. And that book was written in the late 30s, right? Their eyes were watching God. But the I dialect is very difficult if you don't write it in such a way people can't read it. So she wrote the dissertation in the language she understood people to be speaking. It was later changed during the editorial process so that it could be read by those of us who were reading books in 1966. So, but there are some similarities, but his life was much more tragic. Much, much more tragic.
Some interesting thing. I just want probably a little known fact about Dunbar. He was the poet laureate of his senior class in Dayton, Ohio.
Right.
And his first book was published through finances that were given him by the Wright brothers. One was he was a classmate and so forth. And just an interesting story. I always thought that, genius recognizes genius. And everybody else comes along, I guess, later. But with Dunbar, clearly he had this huge range. Her poet, Martin,
yeah,
he does an amazing Dunbar
yes,
presentation. He's done it in Detroit, actually. Was here some years ago, but yeah, he was a groundbreaker. So of course there was going to be this resistance, but it does exist. I mean, it's there, and he is regarded as a cultural hero in Dayton, Ohio. So
The other tidbit there is that Walker went to the Dunbar Centennial, and she read Dunbar at that centennial. And that gave her the idea to do the Phyllis Wheatley Festival. She had gone to the centennial. She was the leading voice there, reading Dunbar. And she read Dunbar for folkways, and she read Langston Hughes and James Butler Johnson for folkways. But she got the idea of having her own festival by going to Dayton, and Herbert Hart, of course, invited her. And the people who were there, I mean, that's when she met Nikki Giovanni for the first time and other people. They were just stunned at her ability to flip in and out of these modalities of, dialect reading poetry, because she was raised on that, but also, traditional kind of poetry. But her skills were enormous and her range was broad. And that's what we don't always appreciate when we just get one or two snippets. It's like we've got a time clock over there.
Look, so one more question. Yeah,
Questions here.
please.
I wanted a tidbit that you mentioned about the broadside being published as these medical documents which validity and practice.
Yeah, setting the record straight, yeah.
Right. Did he write that, or was that a product of researchers within?
No, she wrote it.
All right.
She gave a speech.
All
It
right.
was recorded,
Okay.
and that's when she came to Detroit after Demonic Genius was published.
Okay.
3 years later, he published it as a book.
Okay.
So the two of them together collaborated. He just agreed to finance the publication. And he gave me a copy of it for the book.
The reason this intrigued me is that the word that Margaret used to use all the time, talking about that episode, Roots, was corporate.
Yeah.
That they had corporate operation, and that combines the literary, the media,
All together.
publishing, and so on. And I wondered to what extent her intensity about the corporatization of intellectual activity, right? So it's not just Joe Blow, it's a lot of Joe Blows, whatever. To what extent was that shaped by her experience with the left?
Absolutely.
In Detroit. She was actually, not in Detroit, she was actually bringing a deeper ideological critique to what happened. You look what they did to my song. She's bringing a much deeper grasp to that I think we often lose when we're trying to talk about.
So I would actually say that was one of the factors that supports this notion of the most famous person we don't know, because Walker, the left influence on her life in the 30s was perpetual, perennial, and constant. She would insert it into everything. And what I found interesting and ultimately had to resolve was the counter in religion that she also was wedded to. She was deeply religious. And she saw no conflict.
But that was very typical of that generation.
That period, she was
Black
equally
writers.
on both sides, and at any moment, and in the journals, this deep analysis would emerge about something. I was speaking to another group and I said, there are probably 2 other books of essays of hers that can be published. And hopefully that will happen, because she was writing political analysis all the time in the journal. She would analyze presidents, everything. She has a whole notebooks of nothing but political analysis that hark back to the left. It's always her understanding of systematic racism, exploitation. She calls fascism what it is when it happens. She was deeply, deeply politicized by that era,
By that time frame.
and it kept her sort of out of a lot of loops that occurred later, because she was much too analytical and not able to fit into a trend now and then. But what she felt that she could do with the 1973 Phyllis Wheatley Festival was give women a center place, make them the centerpiece for this new movement. So I use the chapter title is Midwife to the Movement. That is, Walker called women together in 73 and said, this is our moment. And she brought them all to Jackson, Mississippi. And lots of politicking was going on at that meeting. This is Audre Lorde's moment. This is when they got the Kobani Collective together. All of the stuff that happened at that festival later surfaced. People don't know where it came from. It came from her bringing those women together, where they were for a week there together, talking, working, politicking, and then later they go back and other things are jumping on. Nobody understood where it started, but it started in 1973 with Margaret Walker.
Naomi Long Magic.
Naomi Long Magic was there.
And
She brought all the generations together, and Walker's generation was sort of an in-between generation.
yeah, well, she and Naomi, same
She
generation,
and
Taylor Mann,
Naomi.
same generation. Yeah.
Yeah,
And they were also sorors.
yes, they were. Yes, the Alpha Kappa Alpha folks. Thank you for that question.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much for coming. Thank our presenters today. Selling books, Miss Janet is selling books over there. So if you'd like to have your book, purchase a book, and she will be selling them.
Thank you.
So I'm looking forward to seeing you again at our next event, which will be coming soon. Just take a look at our website. That's the best way to find out what's going on at Detroit Public Library. Again, thank you so much and have a good afternoon. That's a good conversation.
Well, we got a lot of history up there.
Yeah.
And you knew a whole lot more of it than I did. You know, but, all right.